Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Animal Liberation Currents webinar, Animal Liberation After COVID-19. We are going to focus today on the animal liberation movement coming out of this crisis. To say that this crisis has been destabilizing is, of course, an understatement. There are critical struggles of all kinds that the left is engaged in. For animal activists, we're obviously going to be focusing on the animal question here. For animal activists, the place of animals in the crisis, including the role in the pandemic, the high infection rates among slaughterhouse workers and the conditions they face inside these plants, contradictory phenomena of food shortages and oversupply, and just the general attention to the food system on the whole has just been absolutely unprecedented. Um, so we need to discuss what the political openings may be here for the animal liberation movement. Is the movement equipped to intervene in the moment in any significant way? What are the strategic considerations for the movement as the crisis unfolds? And this is certainly going to be long term. The crisis is far from over, and there are a great many kinds of struggles ahead. So to help us talk through some of these questions, we're joined by two very special guests. Jan Dutkiewicz is Connie Kaplan Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. And this is until July, where he will then be Postdoctoral Fellow on the Governing by Design project at Concordia University in Montreal. And in the fall, he will also be a visiting fellow at Harvard Law. And he's completing a book on the politics of industrial meat production and consumption in the US, and that'll be out either late next year or early 2022. Welcome, Jan. And Dinesh Wadiwel is Senior Lecturer in Human Rights and Socio-Legal Studies in the Department of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Sydney. And he writes in the field of critical animal studies and disability rights, and he is the author of The War Against Animals, which was published by Brill in 2015, and he's currently working on a follow-up. And it's an early morning in Sydney, so welcome, Dinesh.
Thanks, Michael.
And so, Jan, I'd like to start with you. Maybe we could just briefly revisit the more salient points of the role of animal agriculture in this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. So hello to everyone tuning in. I can't see you, so I hope my connection and video are going to hold up through all this. Right, so the first thing I should say is that my comments will be about zoonotic disease in general, because we don't actually know precisely what the cause of the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak is. And so the reason I say that is because there's a lot of conjecture and we have best guesses, but I can't draw you a very clear, complete causal story. What I can tell you is the broader story of the relationship between agriculture, and especially intensive animal agriculture, and the outbreak of zoonotic disease in general. All right, so with that proviso, here goes. So zoonotic diseases, which are those diseases that transfer between humans and animals and vice versa, now make up one of the driving sources of pathogens and diseases that affect humans. These are primarily viruses. So the best guesses we have are that between 50 and 77% of new human pathogens are zoonotic in origin, which is to say they jump from animals, most likely from what we would call wild animals, often via the intermediary of what we would call livestock animals. So how exactly does this work, and what's the role of large-scale industrial agriculture in driving these trends? So if we think of large-scale agriculture as the application of basically industrial capitalist logics to the production of food, so this is what Jason Moore and Raj Patel call the cheap food regime, which is the production of food, which is both literally cheap, but it's also cheap by virtue of devaluing many of the inputs like land, labor, animals, animal biology, which go into it, right? So it is both literally cheap and cheapening in a sense. So what this system does is it's predicated on the production of monocrops, which are large plantations of individual crops, with a view towards efficiency. So with large-scale animal agriculture, we've got an application of the logics of monocrop production to animals, which is to say that modern animal production, modern animal agriculture, and here I'm talking about the sort of industrialized, intensive agriculture that makes up probably close to 99% of food production in the US and an increasing percentage of food production globally. So you have a system which is predicated on raising animals as efficiently as possible from birth through slaughter weight, which means that it relies on what the geographer Tony Weiss calls the meatification of agriculture, meaning the harnessing of large amounts of sort of oilseed crops, which are monocrops, and large amounts of feed crops, which are also monocrops like soy and corn, processing those as efficiently into feed, and then having these animal monocultures also process this feed as efficiently as possible into a carcass. So for instance, you take a pig will have been modified first in order to provide as much lean meat as possible. So there's an entire breeding process and genetics process which takes pigs and takes out everything that's not necessary to the production of profitable meat. So you take away genes that allow, for instance, for hardiness, for resistance to disease. You take away bone structure, you take a lot of fat away, and you create basically an animal that's as readily a source of meat as possible. You then intervene in the bodies of sows in order that they can produce as large, they can sort of farrow as many piglets as possible. So in order to sort of, I suppose the easiest way to think about this is looking back to Ruth Harrison's phrasing that animals in intensive production are animal machines. So this is the application of capitalist logic to the animal as a machine, a breeding machine and a producer of meat. So with that out of the way, how does that affect zoonotic risk? Well, it does this in at least 3 ways. So the first way is that as intensive industrial agriculture for both crops and meat spreads globally, you have cropland pushing into what were previously wild spaces, right? So this sort of sanitary cordon, which separates, I suppose, like human agriculture and livestock production from wild species, and all the diseases that exist among wild species is broken down, which allows wild species to either infect livestock or infect humans directly. So that's step 1. Step 2, this has one political economic consequence, which we're dealing with SARS, and it's also got a sort of political ecological, political economic consequence. So the second one first. In order to produce animal monocrops at scale, efficiently and productively, they are often kept in very tight confinement in sites, I suppose you could call them factory farms, if you will, that are vectors of disease spread. So diseases of all kinds are actually endemic in animal production facilities. Many of these are not zoonotic diseases. So with pigs, you have, for instance, PRRS. You've got African swine fever, which has killed tens of millions of animals just in the last year and a bit. You've got coronaviruses like PEDV, which in 2013, 2014, there was an outbreak that killed tens of millions of animals. So despite the fact that the industry is very concerned with biosecurity, there's actually disease everywhere on factory farms, right? And in order to deal with this disease, or at least to mitigate its impact, you have an overuse of antibiotics. Antibiotics are used for 2 reasons on factory farms. The first reason being to facilitate the growth of lean muscle tissue in animals. And the second is used as a prophylactic against all kinds of diseases. The problem with this, of course, is that antibiotic resistance is rising among animals, among bugs, among humans. So you've got the emergence based on factory farming of superbugs like MSRA, which is now a major, major problem in hospitals throughout the United States and Canada. So that's sort of like disease vector 1. Disease vector 2 is that in places like China, and here I'm getting to the SARS-CoV question, you have the intensification of agriculture, often driven both by state interests and private interests in places like China. So you've got the intensification of animal agriculture and the intensification of crop agriculture. What this model does is it feeds a growing demand while also creating demand for a steady supply of standardized meat among the Chinese consuming public, which is increasingly urban, increasingly has disposable income, its diet is changing. What it does in the rural production ecology and economy, though, is it drives a lot of smallholder farmers who previously relied on small-scale animal agriculture out of business. They can't compete with economies of scale production, right? This is very much the same story that happened in the United States, that happened in Canada with the introduction of large-scale farming. So these smallholders who have been sort of deprived of their livelihood either are driven to engage in trade in, I suppose we'd call wild or exotic animals, or they're actually actively incentivized by branches of the Chinese government to engage in this sort of trade, perhaps even to start farming previously exotic animals as a way to make a living, now that they can no longer make a living producing small-scale livestock. And so as best we know, it is through this sort of bridge that we have the emergence of SARS-CoV-2, right? Which is exotic animals either hunted because they're exotic or hunted as, or raised as part of a policy to address the shortcomings in the rural economy caused by large-scale animal farming that we have, that this bridge is created. And so we have the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2. And of course, we know that COVID, which is the disease it causes, has since, I mean, I guess I don't have to tell anyone about the extent of the crisis and the breadth of the crisis. What I can say is that this crisis, perhaps the effects of this crisis have been, I suppose, fittingly, most viscerally visible in the fact that hotspots throughout the world, especially in the United States, for COVID infection are large-scale slaughterhouses, so large-scale processing facilities, where workers who, just by virtue of the nature of industrial work on a line, are at extremely high risks of COVID infection. In fact, this is so much so the case that plants about a month ago started slowing down majorly, creating bottlenecks in the industrial meat value chain. And also very tellingly, President Donald Trump invoked the Defense Production Act, which is a Korean War era act that allows the government by sort of executive fiat to force an industry to continue working or to change what it produces out of national interest. So Trump tellingly did not use this act to support the production of personal protective equipment for frontline workers, for essential workers, for doctors and nurses. He did invoke it, however, to deem slaughterhouses essential, right? And so what this did is allowed meatpacking companies like Tyson, like Smithfield, to force workers back to work, literally risking their lives in order to continue processing meat, so there would be no backlog of meat in supermarkets. All right, so I think that's the broad background. And now I think Michael wanted me to talk about, broadly speaking, the logics of capitalist food production sort of beyond zoonoses. Is that correct,
Yeah,
Michael?
go ahead. Sure. Yep.
Okay, cool. I think there's a comment in the Q&A about opening the chat function. I'm not sure how that works. Maybe I'll just leave it to you because I am technologically inept.
Well, let me just tell the participants now. I'm going to leave the chat closed, or well, there is the chat open. It will go to myself and the panelists. If you do have a question, we're going to let Jan and Dinesh talk for a little bit. We'll have a quick round of discussion amongst ourselves and then open it up to questions. If you have questions along the way, please just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, type your question in, and we'll go through them and try and get to them as best we can. Okay.
All right. So I suppose the question, or one of the questions undergirding while sort of Michael's invitation to me, is thinking through the relationship between capitalism and animal production, which is to say, thinking of modern animal production and the current crisis as an outgrowth of a specific capitalist logic of food and animal production. Now, I mean, I don't think I can do this justice in a short amount of time. I also recommend strongly that everyone just go read everything Dinesh has written, because Dinesh is, to me, the smartest, most nuanced, most influential thinker about these issues that I've ever encountered. But I'm just going to try to do a broad outline explaining this relationship between capital and animal production. So I think it behooves us to start with Karl Marx's formula for capital. You don't have to have read Capital. You don't have to be a Marxist. The basic idea that Marx posited, though, is that capitalism is a logic of accumulation whereby money is invested in the production of commodities, and the commodities are then sold at a profit, right? So this is the formula MC(M prime). So the entirety of the capitalist system functions on the attempt by those who have capital to invest it in commodity production, make as much profit out the other end, right? Basic logic of capitalism. How does this apply to food, and what does this do to food production, and especially animal production? Well, food production, that is to say, the biological stuff, the biological essence of food production, and especially the biological sentient essence of animals, doesn't map all too cleanly onto this inanimate vision of a commodity, right? Like a pig is not a widget, a sheath of corn is not a widget. So the modern meat industry applies the logic of capital accumulation to food production, which results in a number of effects, right? The first is the logic of what sort of food is produced. The aim here is to produce food that is profitable. This is very different than producing food in a way that is either nutritious, ecologically sound, desirable for the consuming public, or certainly not that is meant to feed the people, right? Like this narrative that the global food industry exists to feed everyone is a bit of a red herring. I mean, they don't exist to feed everyone. They don't have a social mission. They have a profit maximization mission, right? And the fifth point is that this is a system that is amoral. I would not venture to say that it is immoral, but it is not a system that takes ethics or ethical concerns seriously, unless those ethics, and I'll get to this in a second, either offer opportunities for profit maximization or start impinging on the capacity for profit maximization. So if you have a system that is sort of perpetually self-valorizing and that consistently has to increase profit, it means that profits have to grow. How do you achieve this? Well, number one is by creating markets for your product, which is to say, pushing markets on consumers and creating a consumer base for your products. And we've certainly seen this with standardized meat production. If you look at just over the past century or so, you have massive increases in per capita meat consumption in the quote unquote developed world. And you've also got broad, with some exceptions, trends globally of meat consumption accompanying the rise in GDP per capita. So this has led to a sort of simple truism, which is the more money people have, the more meat they'll consume. I mean, that's not entirely true. A better explanation is the more disposable income people have, the more various industries will target those people and try to normalize certain forms of consumption. So it's not necessarily that people have more money, they want more meat. It's that people have more money and they have more disposable income, and therefore will purchase all sorts of new commodities that it is in the interest of various industries to push on them. Right? So you've got the expansion of domestic markets and the expansion of for markets. The second thing to do is to intervene, as I pointed to earlier, in the product itself. So, and here I highly recommend the work of Alex Blanchett. He's a phenomenal anthropologist. He's got a book just out called Porkopolis, which really traces the myriad steps that go into maximizing the gain and minimizing the cost of animal production. So you've got a modern animal, let's say a piglet, which is basically designed before birth. At the genetic level, it is birthed, it is fed a certain feed formula until a certain age. At that age, it is fed a different formula. It is intervened in different ways so as to maximize its capacity to convert feed into meat as efficiently as possible, right? This is a massive techno-scientific undertaking to maximize the margins that can be squeezed from animal bodies and also the products that come out the other end of animal bodies. Because while we normally think, of course, as food animals, well, as food animals, as Alex Blanchett's work shows, a pig will actually end up in over 1,000 different products and different barcodes, ranging, of course, from meat, but also heart valves for medical purposes. Gelatin, parts of pigs will end up in the toner that printers use. It'll end up in concrete, it'll end up in asphalt. So Alex actually very hauntingly describes this as these porcine worlds we increasingly inhabit, where it's almost impossible, even if you think of yourself as a vegan or an ethical consumer or whatnot, to escape the visceral presence of animal bodies in our entire world because of this drive to maximize the profit from animal bodies. And three or four, let's say three. So point three, of course, and this is Marx's original insight. The idea is to squeeze as much productivity as possible from labor itself. So from human laborers. And these are the human laborers who will do everything from designing animal genomes to artificially impregnating sows to actually working sweeping sow barns to working sort of shoulder to shoulder and jowl by jowl in industrialized slaughterhouses. And so it's no surprise that an industry that in a world that we often call post-industrial, which is a fallacy, relies on very much Fordist industrial line work. You've had historically tremendous opposition to unionization and to collective bargaining. There was a brief moment in American meatpacking where unions were quite strong and you could actually make a pretty good living being a slaughterhouse worker, a farm worker. Those days are long gone. The industry has done virtually everything in its power to disempower labor. And you can see this very much in the current moment when workers literally have no choice. In the United States, for instance, a country where the social safety net has been virtually annihilated by years of opposition to social programs, to the welfare state, various neoliberal reforms, workers' choices are literally to starve or to risk COVID infection working on the line, creating meat that companies can sell at the supermarket or export. And I think the fourth plank, and this is what my book is about, is a concerted attempt by the industry to minimize or quash opposition. So I construe this as a process of eliminating friction, right? So if you think of various things that would get in the way of maximizing profit as friction, be these things unions who are calling for higher wages, or environmental regulation, which would affect everything from where you can put a factory farm or a slaughterhouse, or how you deal with externalities of these operations, right? Or how much taxes you pay. So all the way from these sort of legal issues, all the way through to critique by, for instance, animal rights activists, people shooting undercover footage. All of these things create friction that gets in the way of a sort of a smooth conversion from investment through an animal commodity into sale for a profit. And so my book, which I won't talk about at length, I can answer questions in the Q&A, but my book focuses on how it is that the industry engages in concerted attempts to minimize this sort of friction. And so I think we see this very clearly with the passage of things like ag gag or agricultural gag laws, which have been passed and defeated in US states. I understand there's a law being tabled like this in Ontario and Canada right now. So this is clearly an attempt to use legislation to prevent public access to information about production practices, which might sort of make consumers morally or physically queasy with the products they consume. So this is a centerpiece of the industry's sort of anti-friction activities, but there are many more, right? So you have, for instance, active opposition right now on the part of the meat industry to sort of often preemptively attempt to pass various state level and perhaps even federal level labeling laws that would make plant-based meat alternatives not be able to be called meat, that would make cellular agriculture not be able to be called meat, that would have these products deemed imitations, which under FDA statutes means that they're not nutritionally equivalent. Right, so the industry is constantly involved in these attempts to sort of stymie or prevent critique. And I think that this is very important to pay attention to, because now with the current crisis, the industry is in a bind, because on the one hand, it's now in a sort of a fact that, I mean, this is on Maddow, this is on Washington Post front page. We know that this is an industry that is getting workers sick. And we know that this is an industry that, because workers are getting sick, you've got backlogs on farms, farmers are euthanized, quote unquote, euthanizing, which is to say killing healthy animals by any means necessary. So the public knows this. And so the industry can't really hide it, but they're still using these same tactics. So for instance, you've got the meat industry now in some states refusing to release numbers on the number of slaughterhouse workers who are infected with COVID, which is this sort of humanization of ag gag laws, at the same time as it pushes narratives about meat being essential and necessary part of the American diet and necessary part of what it even means to be American in the first place. And so there's these sort of like clashing narratives, right? Where the industry can no longer quite hide what they're doing. And so they're doubling down on trope, be it either tropes of sort of like dietary necessity or tropes of national value, right? An essential industry that the president had to step in to protect from the pandemic. And so I think these are broadly the dynamics along which we can understand the interaction of the drive to profit with food production, and specifically food animal production. And I'm cognizant of time, so I know that was a bit rushed, but I think that that's enough to get a conversation started. And I'm happy to expand on all of this in the Q&A afterwards.
Okay, that's fabulous. Thank you, Jan. That is a really good overview. Dinesh, you're completing a book on capitalism, which builds on your war against animals. Can you talk a little bit about this, and particularly why Marx is useful for you to understand concepts such as the commodity, the essential place of labor, in an accessible fashion, I guess, for some who are not quite familiar with these kinds of concepts.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks, Jan, for all of that. That was fascinating, and the lovely compliments, which are unnecessary. I don't think my work's that great. And we're all kind of searching around to try and understand what's going on around us. Some people know that I wrote a book a few years ago called The War Against Animals. And a lot of that book was trying to track the nature of the violent anthropocentrism that we find ourselves amongst at the moment. And it's obviously something that probably all of the listeners and everyone who's engaged in animal liberation or animal advocacy is very aware of. But one thing that struck me as I was putting together that book was the way in which capitalism and anthropocentrism come together in a quite powerful way today. And something that, I mean, so maybe to give you an illustration of this, lots of animal liberationists will say that the first thing that they read that put them on a path towards thinking about animals was Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. And it's often seen as a book about speciesism, as about the problem of human relations with animals. But I think one thing that struck me was that, in a way, what we're dealing with is the unique and brutal interaction between anthropocentrism and a hierarchical anthropocentrism, that is the sense that we today perpetuate an idea that we are superior to other beings, the intersection of that with capitalism, and that is the factory farm. And that's precisely what emerges in Animal Liberation. That book is an analysis of that interaction. And I suppose that sent me on a path about thinking about, well, how do we account for capitalism in this whole story? And in what sense do, when as animal liberationists, insofar as we're trying to deal with the problem of, let's call it speciesism or a hierarchical anthropocentrism, as maybe I would call it, how are we also having to deal with capitalism and capitalist agriculture, how they tied together? Many people know Marx was probably the most prominent, well-known critic of capitalism. And one of the things that was part of his critique of capitalism was the recognition that this wasn't just an economic system, but it was also a social relation. So in his thinking, capitalism creates the relations between humans. He was largely focused on humans. And particularly if you think about it, the relation between the worker and the person who owns capital. So that might be the bourgeoisie or the capitalist. What he didn't articulate was what this meant for human-animal relations. And that to me is the big question, right, that we need to unpick is, well, if capitalism is a social relation, what does this mean for human-animal relations? In his most famous book, probably, is Capital Volume 1, the first volume of Capital, which I think he wrote in 1867, or was published in 1867. In the midst of that really dense text, and if you've ever had to deal with it, my commiserations to you, it's full on. In the midst of that, he makes some comment somewhere that there's nothing in the commodity that reveals the conditions of its production. And so what he's trying to say is you can look at a commodity and nothing tells you about how it was produced, about the violence, the exploitation that went into that commodity. Now, we all know this, like we look at something simple like a mobile phone, we don't see the low wage, drudgerous labor that went into it. We don't see the slave labor that might have gone in, or the forced labor that might have gone into dredging up rare earth minerals to go into that phone. So that's something we know implicitly. And I think as animal liberationists or people interested in animal advocacy, this is actually central to what animal advocacy was about, was the sense that there's nothing in the commodities that we see before us, so that might be meat or dairy products, it might be pharmaceutical products, that tells us about the violence that animals experienced in the production of those commodities. And I think in some respects, I think that gives us a good history of modern animal liberation movements, which have tried to respond to this reality. On one hand, one of the prominent strategies has been to try to make transparent the conditions of production. So animal advocates have gone into factory farms, for example, shared footage and photos and told stories about what is going on there to try and convince people about the horrors that are happening, or gone into research labs and done the same. And the other strategy has been to try and get people to engage with the commodity itself, so meat or dairy products or pharmaceuticals, and ask people to change their lifestyle practices, so to stop consuming those products or using those products. I guess for me, there's this question about, does this work as a strategy? And on one sense, I think we're kind of in an interesting time where, I mean, many listeners will know that there's been a flourishing of vegan lifestyle, products and a flourishing of discourses around veganism, particularly in the global north, but not wholly. And to an extent, I think there's some success around these practices. But when I look at the data, it's not so clear to me. So while we've seen a massive success in changing discourses around food and a shift of people towards vegetarian or vegan diets, per capita consumption of animal products just continues to climb in a global sense. And so it's almost like it's not clear that those strategies have actually worked for everyone. And I think in a sense, we're kind of dealing with a structural problem about how do we actually attack the structure that is producing this mass death. The prominent language of lots of animal advocacy is something like go vegan. So change your personal practices and this will lead to change. And in some respects, this is factually true. Obviously, if the whole planet stops using animal-based products individually, then this will kill demand for animal products. But this misses that, you know, in a sense, the driver for this production isn't clearly about the consumer. And you probably would have seen this in Jan's talk, the sense that actually we're dealing with a relationship between consumption and production, and production itself being one of the drivers that pushes things forward. And here I think Marx is just really useful for helping us unpick through this, because he has a very different perspective on the primacy or the importance of production in driving forward capitalism or creating the incentive for capitalism. So some of you, many of you may have read some basic Marx, or many may have read Marx in a way that is deeper than I have, right? But one of the central tenets of Marx's understanding of capitalism is the relationship between the worker and the capitalist. And you might remember that this is a relationship of exploitation. So the person who owns production, the capitalist, employs the worker and does so because of the difference between the value the worker produces and how much they are paid. So those of you who've done a job in, let's say it's a fast food joint or whatever it is, will know that the essence of this capitalist production is that you'll be paid far less than the value you produce while you are working. And that's the secret of making a profit. That's how businesses make a profit, is that difference. For Marx, this was the central driving force for capitalism. So the driving force was the value that could be created through producing stuff. And for Jan, as Jan mentioned, in a sense, this is part of the story for how we approach capitalist agriculture, is the sense that producing stuff becomes itself the driver for profitability. So this becomes the obsession. And this in a way describes actually lots of the world that we see around us. We live in a world where, as we know, we have commodities produced in abundance all around us in a way that is completely unsustainable, that is killing the planet, and it's done so in the name of profit. So we know this in a way. The same logics have applied to animals. So that's one driver that I think is important from Marx in making sense of all this. I'd say that in a sense, this gives us a sense that what is happening in production is important for us to understand, and the particular exploitation of labour in the production space is important for us to understand. I would say as well that we're not just talking about the labour of humans. So I think, to me, there's an importance in trying to understand animals as potentially labourers in there, and there's several scholars, including myself, that have been trying to unpick that, or what would it mean to say that animals are exploited as well. Secondly, we need to kind of understand the consumption side and what this means on the other end. Now, and Jan also mentioned this briefly as well, that capitalism has to do something with all the commodities it produces, and this creates a relationship between production and consumption. So a bunch of products are produced in the name of searching profits, and these have to be sold off to people. And this happens through the wage cycle. So people are paid wages and they go and spend these wages on capitalism, and this on these products that are consumed, are produced. Now this happens in a kind of, let's call it a metabolic relation. I'm going to get back to that, but there's a kind of relationship going on between the production of commodities and the availability of wages to produce, to buy all these commodities that are produced. In the context of food production, what we've seen is a period of 50 to 100 years where this relationship has restructured human diets on the planet. So what we've seen is the mass production, in fact, say the overproduction of animal-based foods, at the same time as the massive restructuring of human diets, so that per capita consumption, and what I mean by per capita is not only that more animals are used as the human population rises, it's that per person, more animal products are consumed. This has changed dramatically over the last 50 to 100 years, so that at this point, today, humans consume animal products at a level that is not comparable to any time in human history. So, and this has restructured the diets of most of the planet. And this is the kind of relationship that has gone on between capitalist agriculture and consumption cultures. Some people, as Jan mentioned, such as Raj Patel and Jason Moore, have made the argument that this has been part and parcel of a process of producing what they describe as cheap food. So you make food available cheaply as a commodity. This enables consumers to eat or consume more and more of these products. But for Rajan Patel and Jason Moore, they point out that this has also been a way to hold down wages because people can buy more with their relatively lower wages, right? They can consume more food. So this is in a way, part of the way to hold down the wage bill of capitalism. Raj Patel and Jason Moore point out that they use one case example, which is the mass production of chickens. They make the argument that at the turn of the 20th century, per capita chicken consumption was relatively low. Chickens were leapt upon because they were relatively easy to mass produce and to promote efficiencies in the production of chickens to drive down the relative costs of chicken meat over time. And this is why chickens have become the staple for actually much of the planet. I'd say the same thing is happening to fish as we speak. So fish are being largely interned in aquaculture or fish farms globally. And this process of driving down the cost of fish products is happening in front of our eyes. And this is part and parcel of this process of capitalist production driving the mass consumption of animal-based foods. All of this, I think, finally gives us a different, if we go back to that human-animal relation that I started out talking about, it gives us a different perspective on all of this. So we are talking, in a sense, about an evolving metabolic relation between human populations and animal populations. Animal populations are now interned en masse in intensive systems, horrific intensive systems, to become the means of subsistence or food for human populations who then go on and labour for capitalism. And this creates, in a way, a kind of bizarre, horrific circular relation that we are caught within. For animals, this means, of course, that more and more animals are thrust into the horror of capitalist production. For humans, it means that animals become more and more part of what's on the dinner table. As in relation to our context as well, pandemics are part of this story. So part of this metabolic relation is the continual production of pandemics as a side effect of this new metabolism we have before us. So to me, again, this is just, it gives us a different way to describe the problem, but it also creates, looking at capitalism in this way, creates a story for us about the interaction that is going on between a violent anthropocentrism or speciesism and capitalism as an economic relation, which has produced, if you like, a social relation between humans and animals that we have to unpick.
Thank you, Dinesh. This kind of discussion is trying to understand how power is actually realized in society and how to appropriate these strategic positions in order to move the movement forward. The lack of these questions, I think it's fair to say that there is a great lack of engagement with these kinds of fundamental questions in the animal movement, and it's kind of an indictment of the movement. This particular crisis, there's more than one crisis at hand. I mean, just before the the pandemic hit, we were already facing a recession in significant parts of the world. Right in the as the pandemic, especially in China and North America and parts of Europe, were starting to really get underway. We're also hit with an oil crisis on top of that. And so there's sort of multiple crises at hand that the left has had to face. And there are kind of significant waves of kinds of struggles. Like at the outset, there were serious concerns over workers being in unsafe places, but then a profound loss of income when the crisis hit means we're struggling with all kinds of matters for basic survival. Rights for tenants' rights and the need for income supports and all kinds of things. As the economy is getting back, is slowly being opened up, at the insistence mostly of the capitalist class, there are still huge dangers ahead for workers, and there's a whole terrain of struggle ahead for maintaining access to protective equipment and social distancing and all sorts of other things. All throughout these waves, there have been also opportunities for the left as well. There's been an enormous resurgence in strikes, probably upwards of 150 by now, of wildcats and other kinds of strike actions, including in workplaces that don't have a formal union at hand. Lots of tenant organizing and so on. I've been struck through all of this at the way the animal movement, given the sort of the enormous focus on animals in a sense at the epicenter of parts of this crisis, there's not really been an effective response. And part of that is there's kind of a structural element at play where the main sort of strategic goals of the movement don't seem to be adequate to address the fundamental problems here. And it is kind of difficult to understand exactly where a rights demand is going to easily work alongside an anti-capitalist demand. I think we kind of need to figure that out in the animal movement if we're going to get anything moving forward. So the big question is, what are the strategic openings at hand for the animal movement, and do we have the social capacity in the animal movement to do that? It seems kind of bleak, although anything could be right around the corner. There's all sorts of issues and concerns and activity bubbling up underneath the surface that are not always apparent. Do either of you have any thoughts about what those kinds of things might look like?
I mean, I have a tremendous amount of thoughts about this, but I don't know how structured they are. So I'll just start, and I think some of these answers will be provocations, and maybe they'll lead to questions that we can then discuss either amongst ourselves or questions from the audience. I suppose I want to circle back to what Dinesh said about the link between capitalism and oppression of animals. And I think if we look, so Kerry Wolf, he's a scholar, he thinks of speciesism not in the sort of Peter Singer sense of speciesism is an individual level discrimination, right? So the same way that I might discriminate against other social groups, I, the individual Jan, discriminate against other species. So Wolf thinks of it much more as an institution. He calls it an institution. And I think this is the correct way of thinking about this, especially in light of what Dinesh said, which is that animal production and animal consumption are inherently normalized throughout the social institutions that exist under capitalism. It's Kerry Wolf with an E, to anonymous viewer asking on the Q&A. So what this means is that in the sort of traditional economist conception, there's this idea that there's like an amoral, apolitical demand for meat. There's an amoral, apolitical demand, or production of meat. The two intersect at an amoral, apolitical equilibrium price, and off you go. But that's actually not the case, right? Constant pressure from various people who have interests in industrial agriculture have normalized meat, not just in the sense of it's absolutely available everywhere, it's at the supermarket, it's cheap, it undergirds fast food, it undergirds fancy food, it's on billboards. Doctors and nutritionists have historically, often without very firm basis in science, pushed the consumption of animal products. Narratives of nationalism, masculinity, strength have been attached to it, as people like Carol Adams have told us. And so what does that whole rant mean? Well, it means that we're dealing with an entrenched, institutionalized set of social practices and social discourses, and not just a bunch of people randomly choosing to individually eat animals and discriminate against animals because they're bad people. Okay, what does all this mean for strategy? For one, I think that we should still be telling people somehow to go vegan. I don't think that individual choice is meaningless and that appeals to individuals are meaningless and that they should be discarded. Number one. Number two, I think that there is increasingly an opening. Okay, let me back that up. I think that there has been a push within the animal interest community broadly to have internal debates about where the animal interest community stands vis-a-vis all kinds of other problems. And I think maybe we could flip that. And I think that there's a lot of common ground in other social movements, be it grassroots movements or be it electoral politics, where there is room and a clear reason for people who have animals' interest at heart to intervene, right? So I'm thinking here about clear elective affinities between debates in public health and the threats posed by animal production, both to individual health and to public health with things like pandemics. And so I see a lot of opportunity, for instance, for people who are interested in pushing and championing animals' interests to become involved in other initiatives that have to do, for instance, with public health. And I'm not saying veganize those movements, but what I am saying is put the animal question on agendas of people who might especially now be willing to listen. In the United States, you've actually got some slaughterhouse workers movements that are actively calling for at least temporary boycotts of meat production because of workers who are being endangered. And so I don't think it's necessarily the right thing to do to opportunistically stand in solidarity with the meat workers at this exact moment. But I think there is room for animal advocates to more broadly become interested in labor movements and engage with labor movements and introduce the notions that we've been talking about of where the production and consumption of animals sits and intersects with these movements, right? So I think rather than having all these internal debates and policing who's a good animal rights activist, do you have to be a left-winger, do you have to be a right-winger, what do you have to care about, to actually find shared interests with other movements doing this work, including at the electoral level, right? So I think that's important and often overlooked. So that's one thing I'll say. The second thing, or third thing I'll say is, and there's a question about this, and I've been doing a lot of work on this, is the question of quote unquote alternative proteins, so plant-based meat alternatives and cellular agriculture. So I'm going to give you my take on this. I think that given everything we've said, I think that given the institutionalization of demand for meat and the de facto production of the modern meat consumer by the modern agriculture industry, I think there is a strong pragmatic case to be made for support. I'm going to bracket cellular agriculture for a second. I think there's a very strong pragmatic case to be made for supporting the development of alternative proteins, definitely plant-based alternative proteins, because the business model behind these products is to fill in a demand, to fill in a taste, a sort of gustatory pleasure that has been created by the meat industry. right? And so I think supporting these products, if they are to fill that niche, and if they are to replace on some people's plates meat, and thereby normalize a certain kind of protein consumption rather than inherently normalizing the consumption of animal flesh, I think that that could be positive, because I think, and this is of course a theory that others have had, the less people are personally involved in a form of injustice, the more likely they may be, these are all hypotheticals, the more likely they may be to opposing those forms of injustice. So someone who eats meat all the time has convinced themselves they need meat, have convinced themselves that meat means something for who they are. And if you tell them to, hey, go vegan for public health reasons or because of animals' interests, they might be very defensive. But if that person starts eating lots of Impossible Burgers or whatever, and that person is no longer complicit personally, and you say, hey, look, so meat consumption, which you no longer do as much, actually is complicit in all these problems, they might be more open to the answer. And of course, I'm just talking about the product. Of course, there are all kinds of broader labor issues that we should push for. For instance, I don't know if anyone's aware of the No Evil Foods fiasco that was covered this week. I absolutely think that if we are championing alternative proteins or alternative products in general, there has to be sort of holding these companies to account for their labor practices. So, I mean, I'm not under any illusions that this is not capitalist for-profit companies producing these goods, but I think it's absolutely crucial to demand at least some modicum of environmental and labor respect from these companies. Okay. Cellular agriculture. I'm happy to have this conversation more broadly. I think cellular agriculture magnifies what I've just said. The possibility of replacing meat with sort of bioreactor grown fat and tissue, if it sates the demand for meat and appetites for meat and minimizes, I suppose, what in economics you'd call switching costs for the average consumer. And if this can affect not simply a change in consumption, but if this can cut into the already thin margins of the existing meat industry, I think there is a strong argument to be made that if the goal is to end intensive animal agriculture, cellular agriculture may be one of the important tools to achieve that end, especially if that technology, and all signs point to yes, can be made without using fetal bovine serum in growth formula and without using animal-based product and scaffolding. So I think that there is a very, very strong argument to be made that, again, we change the means of production. We don't change the product, right? I think that there's a very, very strong economic argument at scale to be made for this, for the normalization of the eating of a certain kind of food, but also the normalization of it being produced differently.
Okay.
So those are three thoughts about individual choice, about strategic alliances, and about alternative proteins.
Thank you. Dinesh, do you have any ideas on these matters?
I do want to say that at the level of strategy, just to add to Jan's comments, I think it's worth keeping in mind or thinking through what our goals are. So I mean, for me, the goal is to reduce and ideally eliminate the use, the suffering, and the deaths of animals. That's the goal. But in a sense, what that translates to is the big question. So to me, actually, that translates to a massive overhaul of the food system, right? So that's one aspect. I haven't talked about experimentation or use of animals for recreation or sport. But in terms of food, it's a transformation of the food system. And I think that to me is an important, thinking through that, what that means is important for strategy, because in a sense, we could evaluate the current strategies and work out, do they actually work, or do they achieve what we're aiming to do? So one of the prominent strategies, I think, of animal advocacy or animal liberation has been something like go vegan, right, as a goal. but I'm not clear that it affects or it gets to where we need to go, which is the fundamental overhaul of the food system. And one way to think about this is that asking for vegan foods may just produce a reality that either capitalism will produce a range of tasty vegan products, which mean that the small section of vegans who live on the planet will continue to be able to buy food and be satisfied, where meat consumption continues going on or meat production continues going on. Or secondly, that we produce a kind of capitalist veganism where the food system is transformed, but continues to be based upon exploitation, right? But in this case, not based upon exploitation of animals. So to me, it's important to just think about, well, what are we aiming for in all of that? I'm interested in what happens if we actually focus on the problem of transforming the food system. So less the problem of how do we create more vegans, and more on the transformation of the food system. And what do we need to do that? It's been interesting to watch the climate change space and to see some of the discussions that have been happening around energy and particularly coal, where there's a growing global consensus that coal is not okay, that we need to abandon coal as an energy source. This has actually led to some really fascinating conversations globally that have involved the unions and workers involved in the coal industries. And part of the language here has been about how do we affect a just transition in the energy system away from carbon emitting industries, away from the use of coal. And to me, there's something tactically interesting about that for us to consider. At this very point, there is an active conversation growing around food system transformation. And this has happened in the context of climate change. But it struck me that animal liberationists and animal advocates haven't really been part of this conversation. And I'm not saying that that's the fault of animal liberationists. I actually think part of it is that animal liberationists actually have been always talking about the food system, but have been locked out of those conversations. But to me, there's something strategic about engaging with that. Coming back to Jan's point about strategic alliances, for this reason, I think there's lots of benefit for opening a conversation or starting to open conversations about how do animal advocates work with labour movements towards this sort of just transition. If everyone is acknowledging that industrialised animal production is dangerous, horrific work for human labourers, then maybe we do actually have a strong case to be asking for this just transition. And of course now, as everyone knows, the arguments are mounting about the non-sustainability of animal agriculture. So we have multiple angles by which to build this coalition. I noticed in the chat or in the question, the Q&A, someone raised that animal advocacy organisations have already been supporting some of the calls in the US for meatless May or for opposing animal agriculture. I think this is a positive step, and this has happened historically, that animal advocates have supported trade unions at different junctures. However, this has to go beyond opportunistic solidarity. It has to be a long-term project of working with other social movements towards social transformation. And that's hard work. It's not going to happen overnight. It has to happen over time.
Yeah, there's also a note in one of the questions about Save Movement and PETA have been trying to support slaughterhouse workers resisting demands to take COVID-related risks and that sort of thing. These do actually seem to me pretty opportunistic in that there's no realistic. I mean, you've got, what does solidarity mean in this particular context? It's not really clear. There is no real live question in the animal rights movement about the question of production and actually building what we want a food system to look like. So these kinds of calls for worker solidarity, there's there's a practice there, but I really do have to question how meaningful it is in terms of strategy, or even how well placed they are. Um, there's something deeper about engaging at the point of production and the ability to withdraw labor, which lies at the heart of capital, which the animal rights movement just has a great deal of trouble recognizing and getting access to. And that does need to be overcome. Someone is asking, what are the weaknesses in the industry and the stories that they tell? And you've actually spent a lot of time looking at this. Are there major weaknesses at hand in the narratives by the industry? And I know they're largely false, but is there something that particularly stands out as something that is addressable in a practical way by the animal movement?
Well, I mean, so there are a number of things. I think within the context of the pandemic, I think and I've been writing about, a lot of people have been writing about this, but I think that was that was a very opportune moment to make arguments about the broader public health impact of animal agriculture. Animal agriculture does not have a strong public health narrative at all, right? So I think making the case, not in the sense of like meat will make you sick, but in the sense of this pandemic, like COVID-19 would not be happening if not for animal agriculture. And in fact, we got off easy because of something like PEDV, which was also a coronavirus, had mutated to be zoonotic. We would be in a lot more trouble. And it's only a matter of time, as Mike Davis, as Rob Wallace argue in their books, that there will be another one. So I think there's a clear opening now to challenge the industry's public health narratives. I think now is the time to also make clear the industry's exploitation of laborers, because it's in the news. So just pick up on it, right? You can't produce meat in a way that is remotely humane, certainly not for animals, but also certainly not for labor. And so I think there are a lot of arguments to be made beyond, hey, why don't you just like animals, that show why this industry is a source of broad harms to public health, to labor, to animals, and to, I suppose in Canada and the US, legal rights, right? Like the right to free speech, the right to access to information. And I think the industry has no pushback on any of these.
Right. Well, there's a question here about addressing the fact that the traditional meat industry is now very heavily involved in producing plant-based proteins and clean meat. That is very true. Tyson is a very notable investor in some of these areas, and quite a few of the large conglomerate meat companies have all sorts of vegan spin-offs. How do we address that fact?
Should I go? Or yeah, so look, for one, this is, I don't want to say it's not a problem because it's a major problem, but this is the nature of food production, right? So an ideal situation for the development of protein alternatives, from my point of view, would be large-scale federal investment in open IP, so that the intellectual property and the patents were in the public trust and could then be sort of farmed out to the private sector, for commercialization. So I'm thinking here of sort of the type of economic development model that Mariana Mazzucato suggests in her book, The Entrepreneurial State. And this is, I think, very much the direction that the folks over at Integriculture and Shojin Meat in Japan are thinking about, which is a more democratized, small-scale, open IP, citizen science-based approach to basically a novel food technology. And New Harvest, which is an NGO that funds cellular agriculture research, has also been funding open IP open IP projects. And I think that that's like, I think inherently, if the project is deemed to have promise, which I believe it does, I know some people in the Q&A and out there don't, then I think that state involvement is to protect, especially to protect IP, but also to fund development, would be central in protecting it from the sort of clutches of big food. But given that that hasn't happened, this is technology that requires R&D investment. And so it only makes sense, sort of a cruel sense, that it will be the companies that are already in this space. So be it Merck investing in Mosa Meat, or Tyson investing in Memphis Meats, or Maple Leaf Foods in Canada buying up all kinds of plant-based products, to commercialize them. But by the same token, if this makes the products more accessible and more popular and speeds up R&D, then it will bring the products to market, right? Where the consumer can adjudicate whether they work or not. I think there's nothing, I mean, this is the nature of capitalism, right? Like Tyson Foods has done great harm, but they haven't done great harm because they particularly are invested in factory farming or herding animals. They've done great harm because they're capitalists who want to make profit on their commodity, which is meat. And if Tyson sees an opportunity in cell-based meat production, as they clearly have, then their investment makes a lot of sense within the logic of the system. And this is an unfortunate truth of developing this technology in under capitalism, but also in the open market, as opposed to being driven by the state, by citizen science. And so I think there will actually be different paths to development of these alternative proteins depending on jurisdiction and state. There is empirical evidence that an increase in lab-grown meat will increase meat consumption. I have not seen this empirical evidence. I don't think that we could call that empirical evidence, given that quote-unquote lab-grown meat, so cultivated meat, is not on the market. So almost all talk about cultivated meat is about a promissory space of a technology which has not been commercialized. So I think that this is a risk, but the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, as it were. And I think making claims that we empirically know something about the benefits or harms of cellular agriculture before the product is on the market is untenable. I think we can say that there are risks and there are perhaps ethical objections. And I think that those are valid arguments that we should have.
Dinesh, do you have any thoughts on these matters?
I just wanted to, and there was a question in the Q&A, and of course we're just not going to get to everything, about what do we do about the fact that the left is nowhere, it feels like, in a sense. So we've got this structural problem that it's not clear what there is in terms of an organized left. And the second question that came up was, how do we deal with the fact that historically the left has been in an antagonistic relationship with animal liberation? And this relates, I think, to the question as well about plant-based alternatives too. And maybe to come a different route from Jan, I think for those of us who are interested in the problem of capitalism and its relationship to animals, then we have to deal with the problem of how are we going to be part of rebuilding the left globally. So we have to accept that in many parts of the world, 4 decades of neoliberalism has decimated trade union movements and decimated the structural base of what we might call the organized left. Crises emerge and they create massive opportunities. I would say this crisis has created opportunities, but we lack the organization to take advantage of the opportunities. But we have to be part of the conversation moving forward. Part of that is conversation about restructuring the food system, but that also is about how do we build a different kind of animal liberation movement that is in dialogue and solidarity with the rebuilding of a left project that includes organized labor. Part of that is about slaughterhouses and meat production workers who are central to the problem, but it's also about all animal agriculture workers. So it's also those who work in plant-based production. So to me, that's the other side of it that we haven't talked about, is how do animal advocates support plant-based production? And that doesn't mean supporting enterprises, businesses. It's actually supporting those who actually do the work in plant-based production. And that to me, I'm not pretending to have the answer. So by the way, there's a question in there about what solutions do you guys have? And I think we've got to come up with the solutions, right? This is the space to talk through how do we deal with this problem. But I think one pathway for us to think about is how do we build the alliances with those who are in the food system to talk about what a just transition looks like in terms of changing our food system. And that doesn't just mean those who work in meat production industries, but those who are producing plant-based foods, the foods that we want to eat, right? So that has to also be part of that solidarity project.
Kim Stallwood wrote that the critiques made of the animal liberation movement so far have not made the point about the need to position moral and legal rights as a mainstream political issue alongside integral such issues as economy, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So then the strategic question is, how do you, in a society which is inherently speciesist and to whom making claims about the moral and legal rights of animals still, for the most part, sound like sort of esoteric mumbo jumbo, which is not rooted in the real world, how do you get there? And I think that given that we started off talking about how important the politics of production are and what sort of electoral and other politics might work here, look, the meat industry is massive and profitable, but operates on very thin margins. So if there are electoral strategies and or political strategies which would force them to pay more to their laborers, if there are electoral strategies that would force them to actually pay to cover the externalities, the environmental and social externalities of their production, if there's a way to put pressure on them, like the bill that Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren just proposed in the US, to sort of phase out new factory farms. All of these things cut into the profitability potential, both of existing infrastructure, and make the industry not necessarily palatable to investors. So the more I think a case can be made for this primary nexus through which most humans are involved in animal exploitation, the easier it will be. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record because this is similar to my case for alternative proteins. The easier it will be to make broader calls for the moral or ethical or moral or legal rights being granted to non-human animals. And so the reason I'm thinking about this is Eric Olin Wright, who was a brilliant scholar and recently deceased, has a book and a much shorter and very accessible Jacobin article called How to Be an Anti-Capitalist Today, where he outlines sort of 4 paths for anti-capitalist movement. And sort of like the weakest, most wimpy one is taming. He calls taming capitalism, which is not eliminating the underlying tendency for capitalism to generate harm, but counteracting the effects or diminishing or mitigating the harms, right? And this is where I see the space for state involvement to protect labor, to impose greater restrictions on animal operations on the one hand, and on the other end, the development of, be it alternative food systems or alternative proteins, that while happening under currently existing capitalism, nonetheless would serve to achieve the end of counteracting some of their greatest and most visceral and most immediate harms. And I know that doesn't sound massively revolutionary, but I think if we could eliminate or reduce the 10 billion animal deaths every single year in the United States, while supporting a push for greater wages for agricultural workers, while supporting the development of novel technologies, to me, on balance, despite the fact that sort of the logics of capitalism have not been overthrown, some harms will have been avoided. And as a consequentialist, that to me is a valid goal.
Dinesh?
I just want to stress that we're not talking, I don't perceive that we're talking short-term strategy. So we're not talking about something that we can achieve overnight. So it's very clear that in the US and other places, trade union power in meat processing has been smashed. That isn't the true everywhere. So places like, so in Australia, for example, much of the meat industry, not all of it, is actually highly unionized, which creates a different problem for animal advocacy. And places like Iceland and Scandinavian countries, again, it's highly unionized. So we've got to kind of evaluate what the strategies are in different places. But I just want to stress that if we think about the history of the place of meat workers, it's very important in terms of labour history. And it's particularly important in terms of US labour history. So many of the struggles that led to the creation of the 8-hour day in the US were largely led by meat workers. Now, that's not to say that that's going to be the future, but I just want to stress that this is actually part of the history of the terrain that we're dealing with, that unionisation has been decimated, and part of the challenge for building change, one of the strategies is to start supporting unionisation. Like, that has to be one of the strategies. That I'm not pretending as well that this is an easy task for animal liberation, because our goals don't coincide. But insofar as we're seeking food system transformation, building democracy and building workers' rights, I think, has to be part of the story.
There is a note here: how can a capitalist vegan food production result in true liberation, as it's based on the oppression of humans as well as the planet and its resources? Isn't it impossible for capitalism to be anti-oppression? And that's precisely what we're talking about here. And I think, to speak to somebody else's point about the problems getting the left more kind of invested in the liberation of animals, is that the animal movement really isn't addressing these kinds of questions about production and about capitalist oppression to begin with. Almost all of the spaces where workers are paid to deal in some way with animals are sites of just horrific oppression. It does mean, like, this question of transition does need to be absolutely at the forefront of the animal liberation agenda. Or we're solving nothing. Like, the animal movement is not a very worker-centered movement, and it needs to be. It needs to take these kinds of labor struggles much more seriously and put an actual transformation on the agenda if it's going to succeed. We all understand that that's not going to be easy, but these kinds of questions are just not at all live in the animal advocacy movement writ large, and even amongst some of the more radical elements of the animal rights movement. That is a big problem. That is a very big problem. We need to kind of solve these issues if the movement is going to grow. There are spaces opened up by this pandemic. Somebody is mentioning again the farm bill being backed by Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren. Well, that it does predate the crisis, but it's difficult to imagine Booker and Warren really being serious about the idea of phasing out factory farms. There are serious live issues right now that are already being discussed in the mainstream about the need to break up big meat monopolies, including slaughterhouse production, disassembly, in order to deal effectively with the pandemic. And pandemics are going to be a serious threat to humans for the foreseeable future. This is a big one, and it's certainly unprecedented, but it's not going to be the last, and it's quite possibly not going to be, they can quite easily be much more deadly. Something does need to be done in terms of public health where slaughterhouses are concerned. The questions here are not about, they have a massive potential impact on the animal ag system, but they're not liberatory initiatives. They're dealing with something different. And these kinds of things are the most vexing for social movements. When you've got crises that are happening because of something else, they are not crises because the animal movement or the broader left has intervened somehow and created this crisis for capital. Do either of you see that Farm System Reform Act being promoted by Booker and Warren as something important for animal activists to engage in?
So I have two answers. So I have a cynical answer, which is no, because it's ultimately quite declawed and doesn't actually achieve the ends of animal liberation. On the other hand, it's arguably the first time since the Humane Slaughter Act of 1958 that there has been federal level legislation which is directly attacking a specific mode of producing animals and calling for its regulation. So if it's not this act, about which, I mean, I have no reason to think Cory Booker isn't serious about it. But the point is that there is potential at the electoral politics level to push for representatives to get these things on the agenda, right? And if it's not this, then maybe something stronger can be concocted with public health language, with workers' rights language, right? And so therefore, I think that, like, is this act the silver bullet that achieves animal liberation? No, certainly not. Of course it's not. But should it be dismissed? No. I mean, I think the fact that this can even be talked about at that level is important and shows the promise of those politics. And of course, those are not exclusively the politics, even remotely, to which this should be constrained. Can I just really quickly answer a question that's been sort of looking at me for the past? So there's a question here. Historically speaking, can someone point to a social justice anti-oppression movement that can be solved by the market? I think this is a crucial question, which I think is in regards to the development of alternative proteins. And here I would say that the entire basis of our talk here has been about the politics of production of animals, which occupy this really tricky liminal space between sentient beings, subjects of a life, political subjects, ethical subjects, and also commodities. So the counter question I would say is, historically speaking, when have we been ever dealing with a liberation movement that has to do with liberating sentient commodities? That is to say, not perhaps humans who have been commodified or dehumanized, but literally sentient life produced entirely so that it can be killed. Life produced by the market in its own image. And I think this makes the animal liberation movement, at least as pertains to food animal production, historically unique, and therefore potentially as one that's going to have historically unique solutions.
Dinesh?
Just quickly, and that's all really great. I was just going to say, history is important. And in a sense, one of the reasons I find reading some of the kind of labour history interesting is that crisis creates unprecedented opportunity. And to read that's the thing about the Booker Warren bill that I find fascinating. It's not that I believe that, as Jan says, that it's a silver bullet or it's going to radically transform debate. It's just interesting at this point in time, a constellation of forces come together, both around the debate that has been happening around climate change and its relationship to animal agriculture, the current crisis around COVID, the brutal reality of what COVID has done in terms of unveiling social relations, and particularly worker relations in the factory farm, and the response that this produces, which is a bill that gets recycled, but suddenly gets a whole lot more prominence precisely because of this crisis. The question for us is, how do we use these moments? So these moments push together unlikely stakeholders who previously had nothing to do with each other, and suddenly there's the opportunity to work with each other. So to me, that's the question, is how do these moments create strategic opportunities for us? And if we miss this opportunity, then how do we prepare for the next time? How do we build alliances and build solidarity, build connection between social movements so that when the next time happens, we are in a place to actually respond?
Exactly. Okay. Listen, we're a little over time. So I know it's always difficult to leave these conversations because there's so much to talk about, and I always feel like we're barely scratching the surface with these kinds of things. But I apologize to anyone if we didn't get to your question today. I do want to thank Dinesh and Yan for being with us today to talk through some of these kinds of things. We'll have to have many more of these conversations, including on some of these specific topics. So I hope it won't be too long before we see each other again. But thank you both so much, and everyone that has been listening, and we'll leave it there for today.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Cheers now.
Bye.